longer. And the total burned area was about 6 times larger in this analysis of Western U.S. Western U.S. forest wildfires greater than 400 hectares. Okay, so, you know, when we think about intensity, right, that study, as you noticed, was done a while ago, but this is a post on September 10th from CAL FIRE that showed that, you know, historically speaking, 6 of the top 20 largest wildfires in the history of California, right, recorded history, are burning this year. So it's not just what was happening a few years ago, this really continues to be an uptick in the intensity of fires. So fires lead to smoke, right? And that's my interest here. So depending on how you think, maybe the left image is more striking to you, maybe the right image, right? This is NASA satellite image. I believe this is from late August. I forgot to pull the date, sorry about that, but just showing this, you know, these massive wildfires all up and down the West Coast and the circulation of smoke across the West Coast and then even across the US. And then the right-hand side shows these purple air monitoring data. And so the numbers themselves, you know, they're an indication of the severity of air quality from a, you know, the poorness as the darker red you go, and the numbers themselves may not be accurate, but clearly just this huge, this, you know, it's striking the poor air quality all the way up and down. And these numbers, you know, again, while we can't trust them exactly, over 100, 150 is hazardous. So very hazardous air quality. Okay, so when we think about the impacts of smoke, I want to point out that it's important to think about more than the megafires, right? So a lot of times it's the megafires that grab the attention, right? That there's these homes at risk. But again, those long burning fires, the fires that we see, the smoke from all of these fires burning at once and over long periods of time. So I want to get into this periods of time real quick. So between 73 and 82, this is another analysis by Westerling, the fires burned an average of 6 days. But between the periods of 2003 and 2013, these fires burned an average of 52 days. This figure on the right was from last year, these really long burning summer fires in the Arctic. So again, while these megafires often grab our attention, in terms of the health impacts, right, we want to think about sort of these long burning fires, this extensive number of fires and intensity of fires. And just from a personal experience point of view too, I spent some time in Colorado. I was there for about 8 weeks in May, late May, and there was a fire burning that during the day you couldn't see any smoke, couldn't smell any smoke, but at night, right, the downslope flows, boundary layer collapses, and the smoke was just filling these small Colorado valleys. So I think it's something we want to be thinking about when we're thinking about the health impacts of smoke, is really sort of on this broader spatial and temporal scale. Okay. In addition, we have visibility degradation, right, in protected areas. So these are all of the reasons that we care about smoke. Okay, so what is smoke? Well, smoke is really a complex mixture of both particles and gases. So thanks to the properties of particles, we can actually see them. They interact with light in such a way that it helps us see the particles. So if we look at this image of a fire plume, we see that these dark sort of smoke, this dark smoke is primarily black carbon. It's highly absorbing of light. You can then also see this brownish color, which indicates the presence of brown carbon. So it's also absorbing, but not as strongly. And then organic carbon, which is this white smoke and does not absorb strongly. So the extent to which these particles absorb and reflect light affects their role in climate, so their climate effects. And as well, these colors, so again, the colors are reflecting composition as I walked you through, and the composition also influences the health effects. And of course, what we can't see here are the gases, which is largely a big focus of my research. Okay, but most of this PM mass, so if we focus on those particles, most of what's emitted from fires is organic, okay? So even though we often think of this black billowy smoke, when we take the mass, and this, we're going to be using this unit emission factor a lot today, so that's the grams of carbon per kilogram of fuel burned. And if we look at wildfires in particular, this is from a paper out a couple years ago, you might get about 24 grams of carbon per kilograms of fuel burned. And you can see that the black carbon is closer to 3, so about an order of magnitude difference, or this particulate OC is about 90% of the total PM 2.5 emitted. Now, this ratio differs a little bit when you look at prescribed fires. So there's sort of 2 points here. So one is that if you just look at the particulate organic carbon, the particulate organic carbon emissions are higher for wildfires than they are for prescribed burns, and that these numbers also vary as a function of fuel type or landscape, right? So this is a montane forest, we've got shrublands, and then more of a sort of a southeast coastal forest. So you see that the emission factors of the organic carbon are higher in wildfires, and you also see that this organic carbon, black carbon split is different. When we look and see what the emissions look like in our models, right, that allow us to predict those impacts of smoke on health and climate, we see that the actual measured emissions are about 4 times higher than current emissions inventories. So what this means is that our models can't capture the PM levels from wildfires very well, and therefore we can't really predict or accurately predict the air quality and climate effects. Okay. So getting a little bit more into my specific research, that this distribution in particulate matter, so PM, right? So we kind of drilling down smoke, particles, gases, and if we think about the PM, the distribution of PM in space and time is driven by both the dynamics and the chemistry in a plume. So if we think about the dynamics alone, we think of dilution. So in time and space, this particulate OC mass would go down as a function of dynamics and dilution. When we think about chemistry, this particulate OC mass in time and space should increase, okay? So when we look at what we observe in the atmosphere, we see that particulate mass typically in time and space either stays constant or it slightly increases and it slightly decreases. And this illustrates this competition between dynamics, dilution, and chemistry. So the focus of my work is really on the chemistry part, where we get what's called secondary particulate matter formation. So walking you through this, we get a chemical conversion of gas phase organic carbon to particle phase organic carbon as the plume evolves. We call this secondary OC, or secondary organic aerosol formation. This changes both the mass and concentration, the mass concentration and the distribution of PM, which again influences both health and climate. Again, this actual process is quite poorly understood in detailed terms. We generally know that there's this chemical conversion, but the details are poorly understood. And again, this process is really not well captured in air quality models. And this is really the focus of my research, both on the measurements and the modeling side. Okay, so I want to take a minute to walk you through a model framework, because the title of my talk, right, was how do we include chemical complexity in simplified models? And so I've motivated that we're interested in being able to predict smoke. Specifically, we're interested in being able to understand the behavior of these organic compounds. We're interested in primary PM formation. We're interested in secondary organic PM formation. We're going to make measurements to improve our representation in models, but let me just show you what little bit look under the hood in the model framework. So this is a schematic of the blue sky model framework, and this is work led by Sim Larkin. And if if we think about the emissions from a fire, there's a lot of inputs to that, right? We need to know something about the fire itself, the fuel loading, how much fuel is consumed, what the temporal profile of that consumption is, and then we get to the emissions. So in my work, we really sort of focus on these two parts, which is what fuels are consumed and what are the emissions that are associated with that fuel consumption. And then we get into the detailed chemistry from there so we can predict things like secondary organic carbon. So from a model like Blue Sky or a model like FIN, we get the total PM 2.5 emission factor, which is a mass per kilogram of fuel, as well as the total gaseous non-methane organic compounds, or NMOCs. From there, we have to actually map those to model surrogates. So one of the first things that I wanted to point out here is that notice the number of model species that we have to treat the chemistry of these organic compounds. I'll tell you it's not very many. So for example, you'll see this ARO 1 and 2, that stands for aromatic 1 and 2. So we might measure, you know, tens or 20, tens of model, excuse me, we measure tens of aromatics and we lump them all into 2 model species. Same thing for these terpenes I'll be talking about later. Notice that we have 1 species to represent terpenes. This is generally, more complicated models exist, but this is the general framework. Okay, so in my work, one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is how you take this detailed list of measured compounds, right? So we know the total, this is fairly well constrained. The mass of non-methane organic compounds is fairly well constrained. I will say partitioning between this gas and particle phase is important and is typically not taken into account very carefully, but this total is constrained. Where it gets tricky is how we distribute this between measured compounds. Can we measure all the compounds? Can we identify all the compounds? And then mapping to this model surrogates. So there's a large source of uncertainty here. And again, this is really sort of the focus of my work. Okay, so the state of the science of NMOCs sort of circa 2010 when we started doing this work, this is a figure that comes out of a paper from Karsten Warnecke showing that there's really a large fraction of the measured gas phase organic compounds that are unidentified. So these are 2 fuel types. There's a chaparral, flaming and smoldering, and these are pine and spruce needles, flaming and smoldering. And the bottom line here is that anything in blue or green indicates an unidentified species. So one of the things to notice too is that this is the mass on the bottom. So what this is showing us is that in general, around this time, we did a better job identifying these low molecular weight, smaller compounds. They're easier to measure, and they were the target of the measurements. And as you move to the higher molecular weight species, there's a lower and lower fraction of identified compounds. And we think that these compounds are really important for predicting PM 2.5 or secondary organic carbon. So it's important to get at the speciation out here to improve the models. Another way to look at this, Bob Jokelson published a summary paper in 2013. So again, we have the fuel types across the top. The different columns represent fuel type. So semi-arid shrublands, pine shrub, coniferous canopy, and soil, and these different emission types, so particles and gases. But just notice at the bottom that for across these fuel types, we get 30 to 70% of that NMOC is unidentified. So this prompted us to try to figure out a way to get at better composition of these emitted organic compounds so we could better predict their chemistry in the atmosphere. We wanted to know, if you want to know how much ozone or secondary organic carbon is being formed, you have to know what's being emitted. So from there, sort of fast forward a little bit, we've now collected gaseous organic carbon samples from a number of locations. So we started this work in the Missoula Fire Lab when we collected samples during Flame 4 in 2012. And then as part of FIREX, we went back to the Missoula Fire Lab. We've collected samples in Blodgett Forest in Northern California during prescribed burns, and we're hopefully going back there this fall. And then also in last year's field component of the FIREX AQ campaign, we collected samples on the NOAA Twin Otter as well as this Aerodyne mobile lab. Okay, so we take the samples back to our lab and we analyze these samples using 2D GCMS. So it's two-dimensional gas chromatography with a time of flight mass spectrometer. I think this picture is hilarious. You know, they take those stock pictures of you in your lab and you're like, what am I ever going to do with them? So I just started sticking them everywhere. So you may start seeing random stock photos of my group all over the place. So for those of you that are interested in the analytical chemistry details, I just put this here, a little bit of a schematic, is that the two-dimensional gas chromatography allows us to separate compounds in 2 dimensions. So we're able to separate columns in this first dimension using one column based on their size. And then in a second column, we're able to separate by polarity. And you can see in a couple slides the advantage of this 2-dimensional separation. So sort of a fast forward from the circa 2010 is that we've now, you know, compared to something like these 99 compounds that we were using. So if you remember back to that modeling framework, I showed you that, you know, there's a list of compounds that you map to model surrogates. If you look at like a Kagi et al. 2011, 99 compounds, we've now positively or tentatively, just this is a technicality based on whether or not we have standards, identified 708 compounds. And this is an average of 120 to 470 compounds per burn or per fuel type. And these are published in our earlier work. Okay, so you can see, right, we're building complexity, and I'm going to get back at the end to what we do about that in our models, but I just want to show you some sort of highlights of this work. So one of the first things that we saw is that these gas the gas chromatographs actually show these fingerprints by fuel species. And it was pretty cool when we started looking at these chromatographs sort of side by side, right? So I'm just going to show you here, we've got black spruce, we have rice straw, Indonesian peat, and what I've shown is the total non-methane organic carbon emission factor, and these are just in single burns. And then the number of compounds we've identified, but without knowing anything about 2DGC, you can just see these patterns are clearly very different. And then what we've done here is we've broken down, we've identified the compounds here, right? So 400 compounds, and we've broken them down into chemical classes because, again, we care about the chemistry. We care about what happens to these emissions as that plume is moving in space and time. So what is shown here, the axis categories are aromatics, oxygenated aromatics, hydrocarbons, terpenoids, oxygenated hydrocarbons, furans, and nitrogen and sulfur containing species. And then the color indicates the carbon number, and then the hatching or the shading indicates the kind of functionality or the compound classes. So things that pop out is this green fraction here. These are monoterpenes. We think that these compounds play a big role in the formation of secondary organic carbons in fires and from other sources as well. This class of furans was very interesting to us, and we've spent a lot of time since thinking about these furans and oxygenated aromatics. And then you'll just see, for example, in peat, right, this strong alkane signature, which is just a totally different class of compounds. And so this hydrocarbons rate, this is here. Okay, so what we also saw that was pretty interesting is that these, you know, these fingerprints are not only show differences between fuel species, like I showed before, but also by fuel component, right? So if you look at the spruce canopy, you see a much less complex chromatogram here. On the other hand, the smoldering duff produced all kinds of compounds, and so you can't see it here, but I mean, there was an unbelievably large number of compounds in the spruce duff. So the point being is that we now start to see these patterns as a function of fuel species and fuel component. And so one of the reasons we started trying to look at these patterns is because I mentioned before, right, we're trying to improve the model representation of compounds emitted from these different fires and fuels. We're trying to improve predictions of ozone and secondary organic carbon, but we have to start thinking of ways to simplify, right? So we were applying these 2D GC techniques, and we were really excited about what we found, but we're also trying to figure out ways to simplify what we're finding, as well as trying to figure out faster ways to do data processing. This is extremely time consuming and is not something that you can spend, every year doing. So we're going to move into some of the techniques that we've been building in my lab to sort of extract further information from the data that we have and speed up the process as well. So one of the new projects that we have is we're building these statistical analysis algorithms, and there's basically 3 steps. So there's a data pre-processing step where we align chromatograms, we take care of missing values, and we do element transformation. Then we go into a feature selection method, and then finally into dimensionality reduction. Okay, so what does this look like? So the first thing is to the peak alignment and matching, right? So when you run a sample, these peaks can shift slightly in their retention times, right? So when they come off the column, but they could actually be the same thing. So you want to make sure that these shifts in retention time don't make it such that compounds that are the same compounds are marked differently. So we align these retention times so that we can make sure that the samples, the compounds in every samples either are the same or different. Okay, and this is just the approach that we use, a little too much detail here, but we use the spectral contrast angle to do that, to compare whether or not these compounds are the same. So we use their retention times and then mass spectra and the contrast spectral angle. Okay, so the feature selection goes something like this. You start with some full or partial list of compounds in a sample. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to see if the measurements of compounds are more different between samples of the same type or samples of different types, right? Because we expect some variability in our samples because of the fuel. So moisture levels, combustion conditions, etc. We expect variability in what we measure. But the question is there more variability between samples of the same fuel type than samples of different fuel types? So this is what the feature selection does. So in this case, we started with our list of monoterpenes because they really did seem to differentiate our fuels well. And then the feature selection algorithm identifies a group of compounds that specifically distinguishes fuel type. So then using this selected compounds, we can run principal component analysis. So we start with a list of maybe 30, we've started with larger list of compounds, and we end with 5 to 10 compounds that differentiate the samples. Okay, so, and again, we've been focusing on monoterpenes for this work. So the first PCA result is that the lab smoke samples were clearly separated by fuel species. So the dark blue represent fir, the yellow represent lodgepole pine, and the pinkish represent spruce. And we've added shrubs to this as well, and it also separates out. So using principal component analysis, we can differentiate at least lab samples by fuel species. For those of you that are interested in the sort of statistics, these first and second components explain 95% of the variance. Okay. So now the question is, can we use these statistical analytical tools in the field to determine the drivers of variability, right? Because again, we could measure, for those of you that have measured emission factors, and some of you maybe even thinking to yourself, she's talking so much about the fuel species, what about this, that, and the other? And it's true, right? These emission factors vary by there's a lot of drivers of these emission factors. There's also drivers to what we measure. And so those are listed here, right? So we know that the identities and quantities of these compounds depend on the species, the component, fuel moisture, fire intensity, fire dynamics. And we also know that the organic compounds depend on the ambient chemical conditions and the meteorological conditions. So the question is, you know, can we determine these key drivers of variability, which again allows us to build simplifications into our model, right? So we want to make our models both more complex, but not too complex. Okay, so this is our second PCA result. When we applied this method to field samples, and these are the Blodgett Forest samples, so these are prescribed burns, we were actually able to separate our samples pretty well by location. So the color indicates different locations. So the number and color indicates different locations. And then in some cases, you'll see day versus night samples. So we did, in some cases, the day versus night samples split. Like you can tell the 602 is a single plot, or excuse me, 60, where these are the day, this is a day and this is a, am I getting that right? No, I'm sorry, that's not right. That is not the day and night. So this is the night of 603, and this is the day 603. So if we look, so the question is, okay, so we picked up the variability. So the PCA works and it separates these compounds, it separates these samples largely by where they were collected. So then when we look at plots, so these are the plot numbers, and we measured from different sample sites. That's what the 1 and 2 in the previous slide was showing. And these are the fuel species composition measurements, so pie charts indicating composition. And at first glance, you can certainly see that, you know, if you kind of step back, that the colors are different in these plots, right? So in 340, we see a lot more of the red, which is white fir. In 400, we see a lot more of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. And so again, it does seem that the fuel species are a key explanatory variable even in the field, right? So that the reason our lab-based method worked to separate these samples is because the fuel species is really a big driver of variability. Okay, so building some confidence in these statistical methods, I'm going to bring you to a more recent paper that we've published where this is showing the terpenoid emission factor. So again, we're zooming in on those monoterpenes. And we have shrubs and other fuel types. The height of the bars represents that emission factor, the grams of compound per kilogram of fuel burned. And the color represents the different types of compounds that we measure terpenes. So sesquiterpenes, they're C15 compounds, oxygenated monoterpenes, and isoprene. And then if we start looking at the conifers, right, we see that the height of the bars, that these canopy emission factors are much higher than the composite log or duff. Then also, if you sort of look at the color of the bars, you see that the distribution of the species is also somewhat different for these canopy and litter fires. So this actually made us very interested in thinking about prescribed burns and the differences between prescribed fires and wildfires, right? Because we often think about scaling emission factors by combustion efficiency, so just scaling by MCE, which in terms of the total non-methane organic compounds works really well. You know, smoldering fires emit more total non-methane organic compounds. But when we start thinking about the differences sort of down in the weeds where we're looking, that alone is not enough to explain the variability and actually doesn't move us much closer to being able to better predict things like secondary organic aerosol or secondary organic carbon. So what we started looking at is how, you know, the actual fuel species and fuel components are playing a role. And then that made us start thinking about the differences in emissions, you know, between wildfires and prescribed burns, because clearly, you know, typically when you have a prescribed burn, you're not burning the canopy, right? So we started sort of moving down that road too, but I don't have time to talk about that today. And also those projects are in their early stages. Okay, so one more slide about building this confidence in these statistical methods, like why we were able to differentiate fuel types. this is actually this was an interesting finding for us. It's probably not a surprise to some of you, but it was just an interesting finding. So here's what we're doing. So I kind of joke here, right, that we have these two trees, and unless you're a biologist or you like to hang out in the woods, like, yeah, I have no idea what those two things are. They look the same to me, right? But this is a lodgepole pine, and this is a Douglas fir. And then again, what we're looking at here, now we're getting into the weeds on the specific compounds that made up that terpene emission factor, right? So we're zooming in on this gray bar here. And this is the fraction of that terpene emission factor that's due to this individual compound. So the boxes here are smoke, okay? So these are our measurements. And then the red is needle essential oils, or the blue is wood or twig essential oil, right? So these are distillations of needles or wood, and this is published data. So what was really cool to see is that, you know, our measurements tracked really, really well with these essential oils in terms of compound composition, you know, really indicating that these are just, you know, these compounds are being emitted sort of in that heating phase. And so it makes sense that they're not all that well correlated with MCE, right? They're not correlated with combustion efficiency necessarily, because they're really these sort of heating products or distillation products. The other thing that it did is it did indicate in some cases, though I don't show it here, where we might actually be measuring combustion products. So when we didn't track well with essential oils or needles, essential oils from needles or wood, it's an indication that we are measuring a combustion product. Okay, and then there's some things in here that just, who knows, right? Variability for sure. Okay, so why have I chosen to dig so deeply in the weeds here? Well, these two compounds behave really differently in the atmosphere. So if you have a bunch of beta philandrine in your smoke versus a bunch of camphene, they influence chemistry differently. These are both monoterpenes, but they have very different structures. They react on very different timescales. And it turns out, we just have a paper under review, that camphene appears to produce about twice as much SOA as a lot of these other monoterpenes. So in terms of like trying to build a more predictive model, this detail matters, okay? But of course we can't represent every single compound, but we're really trying to figure out what matters and how do we build that into the model. Okay, so I've got one preliminary slide from some data that we took during FIREX field, the field campaign. And, you know, it was kind of neat to see that we do still see this evidence for unique fingerprints, even in the wildfire field samples. Okay, so this left signal, so I'm going to just bring you and remind you here that beta philandrine was the most prominent monoterpene in our lodgepole pine samples, and camphene was one of our most prominent dominant compounds in our Doug fir samples. And note that beta philandrine is not found in in most of the other pine, fir, or spruce samples. Okay, so it's kind of a unique marker. Okay, so if we look at this Nethker fire, we do see, this is the beta philandrine signal. So we do see the heat map, right? The color is an indicator of concentration. So we measured a lot of beta philandrine in this Nethker fire. Now, the fuels reports are a little bit tricky, but if you go back, you do see that there was a large fraction of lodgepole pine burned. This is in contrast to the Ike's fire, which there's basically no beta philandrine and is likely a completely different fuel composition. Okay, we can also see, for example, in this Canyon fire in Oregon, so now we're looking at camphene and beta philandrine. So this Canyon fire, there were a lot of shrubs and grasses and ponderosa pine. So again, we actually saw no beta philandrine there, so no lodgepole, and a very small camphene. On the other hand, in this cow fire, we actually see a big camphene signal, indicative perhaps of some of this spruce, the fir species burning. Okay, so I'm switching gears here. So to sort of sum up, we've measured very large number of compounds from a wide range of fuel types, fuel species, fuel components. We are looking for evidence that this variability exists in the field. We're evaluating the importance for the chemistry, and we're thinking about ways to include this complexity in models to improve predictions, but also thinking about ways to scale things back, right? So we really want scalability. We really want the ability to include a lot of chemical composition when you need to, or simplify things when you need to. So that brings me to one of my final slides. I want to introduce you to a tool that we've been building in my group called NEVA, which is the Next Gen Emissions Inventory Expansion of ACAGI. So the objective here is that we wanted to create a repository of measured emission factors. And I want to acknowledge here that there has been a lot of recent work on emission inventory compilations. And I want to mention the Sarah emissions inventory, and Susan Pritchard led that paper. This is an awesome website on, I believe it's linked through the USDA. But in our work, we're focused on the non-methane organic compounds. So we have they've included the cost emission factors in that inventory. So they've included a large number of organic compounds, but it's really been our focus. So just to indicate, recognize this really great work, we have a slightly different focus. So we want something that's easy to update, right? Because now there's all of these large number of field campaigns. There was WeCan, there's FIREX, there's a lot of data coming. There's been a lot of data since ACAGI. We want it to be easy to update, but one of the, couple of the big things is that, we wanted to include the detailed speciation from many of these recent lab and field studies that are using this advanced instrumentation. We want to retain information when data is averaged or reduced. So we want to include the recommended EFs, but also allow user flexibility. And one of the biggest things for me is we want something that links these compounds, their emission factors, and their chemical and physical properties, as well as model surrogates to facilitate the model application. So I think this part is what's really new about what we're doing is we want to facilitate the transition of all these new measurements actually into models. So I'm just going to say that basically we started with the ACAGI et al. 2011 and the 2015 supplement. We've added data from 20 additional publications. They include data from sort of single fuels as well as multiple fuel publications. We've updated fuel types, savanna, temperate forest, tropical forest, chaparral, peat, crop residue, open cooking, dung burning, cooking stove, and garbage burning. And while the data from all these 20 publications have been added, when we have data sets with multiple fuels, we're still sort of working on adding each data set. We've developed a couple methods for merging these data sets. It can be very tricky with all these detailed organic carbon speciation. There's a lot of different names for compounds. Depending on the instrument used, you might only report a mass to charge ratio, an exact mass. In the case of gas chromatography, we typically report the retention times. So it's been some sort of task to figure out how to actually merge these databases. And again, figuring out if we have unique compounds or different compounds or the same compounds. Okay, and just in general, for a given fuel type, we're increasing the number of compounds by about an order of magnitude. Now, keep in mind that that total mass, organic carbon mass, doesn't really change, right? That gas phase mass is fairly well constrained, but we're adding complexity in the identification of those compounds, which should allow us to improve the chemistry. So a visual representation of what we've included in this database, we have these compound identifiers. So when available, their name, an IUPAC chemical identifier, molecular formula, exact mass, their retention time, and some primary and secondary chemical classification, which just might mean that it's an alkane or an aromatic. And if it's an aromatic, it has one or two substituents, information such as that. We've also linked the compound properties. So when you pull up a compound by its ID, you will also know its molecular weight, It's smiles, which is just sort of a representation of structure, but only using letters. The the oxygen to carbon ratio, vapor saturation concentration, which measures its volatility, solubility and Henry's law constants, and reaction rate constants. So now we're sort of tying these sort of more traditional inventories to what you find in, in models for prediction. So, and then it's tied to the model surrogates. So each of these compounds, if possible, are linked to the model surrogate. Right now we only have SAPRAC and Mozart, but we can add more. And then of course the emission factors. So the emission factors are marked by where the sample was taken, the fuel type, the species and component to the extent known, burn identifiers such as MCE, and then we have the publication details as well. So these layers are then linked by the compound identifier. There are additional compound identifiers and properties, and this surrogate part is, like I said, it's kind of a work in progress. Okay, so to sum up, we've really learned since we started this work that GC-GC-TOF MS analysis of smoke samples is in fact a powerful tool. It does bring unique information to the table, but the analysis of these samples is extremely time consuming. So we keep wondering if we have to measure more fuels. I think we still need to measure in the Southeast US, but I think we have the Western fuels well covered. We're building these statistical analytical tools to increase the efficiency with which we can analyze these data sets. And we're trying to retain additional information, but we're also trying to figure out ways to categorize and collapse information as well. We're rethinking the approaches to including these measured compounds in existing and new model frameworks. How we integrate with these other inventories that I mentioned is an important aspect. I didn't talk much, but in terms of new model frameworks, we're thinking about, for example, how we map individual organic compounds to these model surrogates. And in some cases, we actually we may need to rework our model frameworks and add new compounds, for example, add new model surrogates. Okay, so in final, my final point here is that we're also trying to figure out where our remaining areas of uncertainty are. I talked a lot today about the complexity of emission factors, of organic compound emission factors. I talked about their clear dependence on, it's well known that total is dependent on modified combustion efficiency. But I think that I've showed that we also have a dependency, at least for some subsets of compounds, on the fuel species and the fuel component that we may need to take into account for improving predictions. But what other factors might we need to consider? And I think one of those that we haven't talked about is this idea that the amount of gaseous non-methane organic carbon and the particulate organic carbon, those are not necessarily static quantities. And I think that that needs to be addressed at some point. And we're just always looking for new opportunities to make measurements when it makes sense, where we think there are data gaps, and to figure out ways to both add complexity, but also simplify models. And with that, I'll stop and just thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk, and I think really broadened our horizons as we've been, at least in Northern California, under this cloud of smoke for quite a while now. So we've got some great questions from the audience. Again, we're going to be taking questions until 4 o'clock, and then we'll switch over to a discussion, and that's been shared in the chat, and I'll share it one more time. So the first question is from Susan Vallet. Why do the carbon levels differ between wildfires and prescribed burns? Is it just because it's a hotter fire?
So that's a good question. So I do think it has to do in part with what's burning, right? So we showed later on, just looking at the terpenes, that when, there's a lot of carbon storage in the canopies. So some of that just has to do with what's burning. I think the other thing that happens is when it's burning when fires are burning let's see. So yeah, so the total has to do, I think, largely with the carbon storage. And I will say, if anyone, this is somewhat new to me and trying to understand why we see differences based on these, sort of different components. But I think that that's the biggest thing. I also think you got a lot of these in the wildfires, things are really hot. So you get all this like pre-front heating, right? And the kind of things that we measure are being released in that heating phase. I hope that answers the question.
That's great, thank you. So the next question is from Benet Dara Abrams. Are there any significant differences for modeling between northern temperate fuels and, say, Amazonian fuel types?
I do think so. I mean, we have yet to put this, to link all of this like in a three-dimensional model, but the differences that we're seeing between fuel types have to influence the chemistry. And I think, and I will say that I am I'm quite familiar with like the fuel classifications across the US. I'm less familiar with the fuel types, across the Amazon, though, I'm aware in terms of a biogenic sense, because the biogenic emissions are so different, I understand that the species are different. And so my guess is that, yes, I do think that the speciation matters. And I think I think once we finally get it all linked, it's going to show that it makes a difference, and even in these regional scale models.
Thank you. So the next question is from Brian Mayarella. Has this year provided the opportunity to collect a very large set of data under different fire conditions that could be used as a training set for an AI approach?
I love the idea of using an AI approach. So, honestly, right now, we've been really focused on the lab data, and especially I think that data would be amazing for an AI approach. One of the reasons that I like at least starting with the lab data is that very well the fuel types, the fire conditions, etc. Now, we are trying to figure out, as you saw in this talk, if we can actually link that. It's so simple. Then when we try to link to the wildland fires in ambient conditions. But so the problem sort of is, if you just were to go out and measure a bunch of wildfires smoke, we don't have constraints on things like what fuel types burned, right? Because it's not likely that for all of these fires, there's been good fuel surveys done. And then there's probably not going to be any post-fire surveys of what burned and how much. So theoretically, yes, we should be measuring all the time, but we're not, because there's so many unconstrained variables, unless it's sort of a prearranged condition like the Blodgett fires, or like in the case of WECAN or FIREX AQ, where it's a bunch of people coming together in an organized fashion to measure wildfires.
Thank you. So these next two questions are kind of combined, and it's interesting. So the first part is whether there's unhealthy levels of PM 2.5 present potentially when you can't smell the smoke. And connected to that, what are the compounds in smoke that we smell?
That's a really good question. So yes, I think that that's true. And, honestly, recently, so I'm really close to a fire here, and I had been, when you smell the fire, you're like, okay, no problem, I shouldn't be out. But I had a situation where I guess I spent an hour outside exercising and I felt terrible, and I looked, and the PM levels were surprisingly high. And most of the time I do feel like you can smell it or see it, but I do think this is the case. We can sort of get this like relatively high concentrations and not know it. I'm embarrassed to admit that I don't know the type of compounds that make the campfire smell. I know that terpenes give us the, forest smell. And I know that, when you smell like rotting things, they're amines, but I have to say that I don't know what makes the campfire smell. So hopefully if someone out there knows, you can chat it in. I also want to say, I need to give a shout out to the FASME campaigns. If you go online and you look at FASME for the last question, sorry to take up more time, but the FASME plans for measuring really indicate the complexity needed to attach all of the drivers of smoke and fires with emissions and chemistry. And so, you know, just going back to, unfortunately, we can't just go out and measure things. I guess I just want to make that shout out.
That's great. So we have another question from my former colleague here, Arnaud Trouvé. So the question is, he said, I think you pointed out that emission factors are system variables that depend not only on fuel type, but also on system factors, such as the ventilation within the fuels, flaming versus smoldering. Can you explain the value or limitation of compiling emission factors as a function of fuel type only?
So so we're not only looking at fuel type. So we have the ability now, because we've taken so many lab fires and field fires, to look at variation in other drivers. So modified combustion being one of them. So far, it really depends on what we're looking at. So the terpenes are the best example. I like to use them because most of the time people just say, oh yeah, everything scales with MCE. But it turns out that not everything does scale with MCE, and terpenes are one good example. So we've looked to see, and so in that 2019 paper, we showed that the strongest driver of the variability in the emission factors of terpenes is in fact fuel species and fuel component. Yeah.
Thanks. And that gets a lot to my own heart in the combustion dynamics of the fuel.
Yeah.
And so there's another question by Will Abrams, and I'll shorten it for time, but I think the question is getting at the health effects and these current sensors like purple air versus air now. And are these, you know, giving us good public health recommendations, or are there other things that we should be doing? And I think along the side, you mentioned the terpenes, but is that what we should be worrying about? Is it just the PM 2.5 for health effects?
You know, so most of the time, you know, mass is just the best proxy we have when we think about particles. There have been studies that have shown specific components have different health effects. You know, there's also a large number of air toxics that we didn't talk about that are associated with smoke. So, you know, things like formaldehyde, for example, or ozone can be produced or destroyed, but when ozone is produced from fires, right? So those are all important for health. I think digging into these details is important for predicting total amounts of these pollutants. And I don't think any of these individual compounds like we're talking about are on their own important for health. Purple air, yeah, you know, I think that, again, these low-cost sensors are not necessarily quantitative, but they certainly give us trends, and they certainly tell us, you know, when there's differences, and are good indicators, I think, of hazardous air pollution. I think that that's been shown, even if we have to be careful about the concentrations. The concentrations themselves are not accurate.
And so we're running out of time, so I'll read one last shorter question. A reminder, we'll get to the rest of the questions in the discussion section. If you can join us, I'll send a link one last time. So the last question was, great talk. Wondering if you've seen any differences in composition between forest, or I assume any wildland fuel, and wildland urban interface, or urban burning.
Well, so we have not looked at any. So, okay, so when you talk about the wildland urban interface, I'm assuming you're also meaning then when we get like burning of anthropogenic things, houses, cars, etc. And no doubt there are differences in the emissions. We have not, because we haven't really measured during any catastrophic wildfires where houses or other have burned, we personally don't have measurements of those things. There is a group out of UC Davis led by Tony Wexler and Keith Bine. They actually are working on some of that. They have measured in some of these conditions where those types of things are burning. So yeah, there's no doubt that that set of emissions is different, and I think does have different impacts on health.
Okay, so I think we're out of time, but just give you one more thanks and round of applause. Unfortunately, I know everyone else is muted on here, but I encourage you, once we close this talk, the link is going to disappear. So please either check your email or copy the link right now. I'll give just a minute before we log into the other Zoom meeting. So thank you for attending. And if you can, please join us for our discussion with Dr. Barsanti one more time. So thank you again for your time and great presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.